I need to start by telling you about the British Rail sandwich.
2 slices of white bread, a layer of creamed butter, and a choice of 9 different fillings. Jump on a train in 1971 and you could tuck into any of these for the equivalent of about £2.18 in today's money. All while travelling the length of the country on a now classic Intercity 125.
Far from being embraced as a bargain bit of grub, however, the British Rail sandwich gained a pretty rotten reputation.
Some people have even complained about British Rail food, saying it's not absolutely tip-top value. Well, I mean, look at this. That's a load of rubbish.
The exact criticisms varied. Sometimes they were said to be too stale, sometimes too soggy. The details didn't really matter, because more than anything, the British Rail sandwich was political. Arguably the second most important sandwich in British political history.
And we are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
See, from the 1940s to the 1990s, British Rail was among the UK's most visible state-owned industries. For those who wanted to see such industries privatised, the supposedly bland British Rail sandwich became a searing symbol of exactly the kind of bland society which, they argued, a country built around state-managed industries produced.
Dynamism and correct sandwich moistness would only be possible with the free market.
When the Conservatives eventually privatised British Rail in the 1990s, Tory MP Andrew Roberthan celebrated the end of an era of, quote, leaves on the track, inefficiency, late trains, restrictive practices, but first and foremost, old dog-eared sandwiches.
It would be a reach to suggest that some slightly lacklustre rolls were the only thing which brought an end to Britain's first experiment with publicly owned rail. And yet, the aftertaste of the British Rail sandwich long lingered around the industry.
As recently as this January, Reform Party MP Richard Tice demonstrated his razor-sharp grasp of popular culture by describing some of his political enemies as being like a soggy stale sandwich from the old British Rail, an organisation which, at this point, hadn't existed for just shy of 3 decades.
That's about to change. In November 2024, the UK government passed the Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Act, which began the process of bringing significant chunks of the UK's rail network back into public ownership.
The new organisation will have a slightly different name, Great British Railways, and yet, just as British Rail did before it, it will see rail services in the UK run by a state-owned company.
In today's video, we're going to speak with an economist, an engineer, a historian, and the UK's rail minister to see whether Great British Railways can avoid some of the PR pitfalls of its predecessor and steam ahead into a future of publicly owned rail. Or diesel ahead, I guess, because that's diesel.
Then I was the chair of Network Rail for 9 years, and it's from that job that I came here. But I've been in this industry literally all my working life.
This is Lord Hendy. Lord Hendy is the Minister of Rail in the UK's Department for Transport.
I was asked, it was a great privilege to be asked to be a minister in this government, and I believe the reason I've been asked is because I've got a whole career background in transport, and the government's programme for rail reform is a very big issue.
I arranged to come up to London to grill Lord Hendy on why the government feels the UK's rail network needs such a radical intervention and what he and his colleagues are hoping to achieve with these plans.
You said there that this is like the biggest reform that the rail network has gone through for 30 years. And I guess from an outside perspective, that would suggest that maybe the government feels that not everything's going particularly swimmingly, maybe, or not perfectly at least, with the rail network.
Absolutely right, and I'm passionate about it because I chaired Network Rail for nine years, and what I saw as the chair of Network Rail was an industry where many people in it were struggling to make it as good as they could in circumstances where incentives were misaligned, some of the commercial deals that had been done previously got in the way, and the result was that passengers and freight customers, for that matter, didn't get the service they deserved.
See, in recent years, Britain's railway network has found itself in pretty dire straits. In February 2024, the polling company Ipsos did a bunch of research into what people's perceptions of the railway network are, and the results were not fantastic.
Just 19% of respondents said that they thought Britain's railways offered good value for money to passengers. 22% thought they could be relied on, and as few as 20% felt that they were well run. Worse still, a mere 16% of people had any hope that things would get any better over the next 12 months.
Expensive, unreliable, badly run. That is the general impression which has come to haunt train travel here in the UK.
Does that kind of perception matter?
Yeah, it does. It matters. I think it matters hugely. I can still hear announcements when I sit on stations saying, oh, well, your train's delayed because of a Network Rail infrastructure fault. People don't care whose fault it is. What they want to know is that somebody's trying to fix it.
Looking at some of those problems, I guess, there are all kinds of routes you could have gone... Fun pun, sorry. There are all kinds of routes you could have gone down in terms of seeking to fix some of those challenges. And why renationalise it? Why has renationalisation kind of become front and centre to that?
So look, the Labour Party was committed to public ownership. The really important thing is that one set of people, one chief executive, one set of management, one board are going to be very, very largely responsible for everything that goes on. So there's nowhere to hide. It might not be perfect, it probably never will be, but they should feel every moment of every day that it's their job to make this as good as it can be.
If the general public agree with Lord Hendy that the rail network isn't in great shape, they also agree with his solution. Polling has consistently found support for renationalisation to be over 50%.
For a government which does like a good U-turn, rail reform is also something that they've really kept on track with.
At time of recording, 4 so-called train operating companies which run rail services in Britain have already been nationalised. They joined 4 others which were already being run by the government before these recent reforms came through, because the private companies which were supposed to be running them either fell into financial difficulties or performed so poorly the government stepped in to take them over. Sometimes it was both.
The crucial question, though, is will it work? And in order to find out why, we first need to go back to the 1990s to explore why the railway network was privatised in the first place and find out how things went quite so badly off the rails. This is a child's hat, which actually fits ridiculously well. Okay, so between 1948 and 1994, every part of Britain's rail industry was run by British Rail. And I mean everything. I'm talking stations, track, freight, passenger services, all of it happened under one roof.
It must be said, I wrote a book called British Rail, A New History, which looked at the history of British Rail over the space of its 50-year existence. And while there were some bumpy periods, particularly at the beginning, at the end, the last 10 years, British Rail was a very effective, efficient organisation.
This is Christian Wolmar. Christian is the author of several excellent books about the history of rail in the UK, including 2022's British Rail: A New History.
I covered rail privatisation 30 years ago, and I'm now covering the tangling of rail privatisation 30 years on.
Christian explained to me what the rationale was for privatising Britain's railways in the first place.
Well, it was a fairly shambolic process because the Tories slipped it into the 1992 manifesto on the expectation they weren't going to win the election, but then surprisingly they got a majority of, I think, 21 or something, which is enough for them to really govern through the 5 years.
Now, this is far from the first time that we've talked about privatisation on this channel.
Privatizations, privatization, privatizations,
Privatised. And most modern British privatisations were conducted by the same person.
Thatcher,
Margaret Thatcher. Maggie Thatcher's. Which makes rail privatisation a little bit different.
See, Margaret Thatcher did opt to sell off Britain's gas, telecommunications, water, electricity, and aerospace industries, among plenty of other stuff, during her time in office. The railway, however, was one of a handful of state-owned industries that she decided to leave largely alone. In 1990, however, Thatcher was replaced by this guy, John Major. Major was seen as a bit of a lame duck. When the time came to face an election in 1992, even he expected to lose to Neil Kinnock's Labour Party. When Major included a pledge to privatise British Rail in the party's manifesto then, he wasn't too stressed about the details.
Come election day, Major snatched a slim majority, which meant that suddenly he did need to be stressed about the details.
They then scrambled around Whitehall kind of, trying to work out exactly what we're going to do. And I really think there was a man with a notebook who was kind of going around various bits of government trying to kind of work out what to do.
There were three main options for what form a privatised rail industry could have taken.
The most straightforward option was to float the whole of British Rail on the stock exchange as one massive company. Nice and simple. The second was to divide the company up into four, with each new company taking charge of a different part of the country. And this would have reset the industry to the form it had taken immediately prior to nationalisation back in 1948.
In many respects, that would have been a lot better idea, but it wouldn't have then meant that there was competition between the different operators, on the same tracks. And that was their kind of nirvana.
Maintaining either one national company or several regional ones would ensure that each of those companies continued to have a monopoly over the routes they ran.
As such, Major decided to take a sledgehammer to the whole industry. British Rail was broken apart and sold off as over 100 different companies, with each having control of a different part of the sector.
Okay, let's do this. So the actual rails and most of the stations, they were all sold to a company called Railtrack. The day-to-day maintenance of those rails, however, was handed over to a different set of companies, kind of maintenance companies. This chap, I think, is actually meant to be a firefighter, but he's already got his own PPE, so let's re-recruit him for some rail maintenance instead. Freight services, they were meant to be split up between 6 separate companies which then compete for different kinds of business. But a bunch of rapid mergers around the time of privatisation meant they ended up in the hands of just 2 companies. Yay for competition. Where things got really wild, however, was with regard to passenger services, the kind of trains that you or I might get. The physical trains themselves, they were sold to a bunch of companies which came to be known as rolling stock companies, or ROSCOs, which essentially operated like car hire companies. The actual operation of a service, say like the 925 from Penzance to Truro, those were taken over by what came to be known as train operating companies, or TOCs. This chap, he is actually a police officer with a gun, but he's going to use his life more usefully and become a train conductor instead. The new business model was that the train operating companies would bid to the government for permission to run a bunch of services, usually in the same geographical area. Once they had that permission, they would then hire the trains themselves from the ROSCOs. If nothing else, a fantastic time to be a graphic designer. Just so many logos needed designing.
There was some logic behind all of this. The government realised that generating competition at the stage of buying tickets was quite difficult. People tend to need to get a particular train or they don't. The hope then was that carving the industry up into dozens of pieces would mean competition would emerge elsewhere, as ROSCOs competed for train hire fees or maintenance companies negotiated prices on their contracts.
The result, however, was an industry which was kind of a mess.
The creation of 25 franchises, of about a dozen engineering companies, of Railtrack, which was separate from the train operations, various regulators. I mean, about 100 companies kind of emerged from it. So it was a very kind of hastily put together plan without really a clear idea.
If we wanted to point to an apparent success of privatisation, it was in increasing how much the network was used. Throughout the course of the 20th century, Brits had largely been abandoning trains as cars became more and more affordable. Post-privatisation, however, this began to change. An increase in the frequency of services contributed to a rapid increase in the number of people getting the train, to the point there were more train journeys being made each year than at any other point since the Second World War.
Now, the big success which the privatised supporters point to is that there was a big increase in the number of people using the railways. But to my mind, that was, largely what I would call extraneous factors. That they were not to do with the brilliant performance of the rail companies, but rather were to do with the fact that the economy is growing, that people wanted to use and live near railway stations, and that was a big boom.
Where privatisation failed, however, it really failed.
I feel like it's a fairly widely held opinion that privatisation hadn't been a roaring success. Can you maybe speak a little bit to some of the ways in which you don't think it worked out so well?
Well, the first one was security and safety, actually, because there was a series of crashes, which I wrote about in my book, Broken Rails, a series of 4 major crashes at Southbourne, Ladbroke Grove, Hatfield and Potter's Bar, all of which happened within the first 4 or 5 years of privatisation, and all of which can be ascribed to the way that the railway was broken up so hastily, and various kind of responsibilities towards safety were not kind of properly allocated to any particular companies.
Railtrack, the company which had come to own the infrastructure aspects of the network, lasted less than a decade before a series of fatal crashes prompted the government to bring it back into public ownership as Network Rail.
The biggest impact for most passengers today, however, has come in both cost and quality of service.
As with all privatisations, the broad promise was that selling off the railway would lead to more competition and thus to lower fares. This hasn't happened. By 2018, the cost of rail travel adjusted for inflation had increased by more than 20%. This was in spite of government subsidies to the industry having tripled.
Given the cost pressures that the rail industry was costing more to operate, they were never going to kind of reduce the prices. Or even actually keep them stable. They actually kept on increasing. At some point, the fares were going up by, RPI plus 1%.
The system wherein the train operating companies would bid to the government for permission to run a group of services didn't actually involve all that much competition beyond the initial bidding stage. This potentially incentivized a system wherein the train operating companies would sometimes put together somewhat optimistic bids for how efficiently or well they could run a group of services, and then, if the numbers turned out not to quite add up, to sometimes simply walk away and let the government pick up the pieces.
This reached pretty extreme levels during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the government was forced to step in to provide billions of pounds in support to keep rail companies in the black. Where privatised companies were supposed to be taking on the risk of running services, then the fact that the rail network is just so important means they're effectively too big to fail.
There are then quite specific failings which privatisation has led to, but there's also a much broader sense of chaos and decline.
Here in the country which invented the steam-powered railway, the sheer bizarreness and inefficiency of this chaotic privatised system has led to a feeling that the railways can't work. Which means Lord Hendy and his pals in Parliament have a pretty big task ahead of them.
Let's start by exploring one of the most direct ways in which most people experience some of the present shortcomings of our current rail industry: tickets and pricing. But to do that, we're going to need to head to a train station. Like a real one. Sort of stolen valor around here. If there's anything that anyone in the UK will want to tell you about using our rail network, it's that catching a train can be eye-wateringly expensive.
In December 2024, the European campaign group Transport and Environment published a report which revealed UK rail prices to be amongst the highest in Europe. Prices on Avanti West Coast trains were, it said, 1.5 times the average European fare, whilst GWR was charging 2.5 times the average European fare.
If you look at a bunch of different countries, whether it's quite high density countries like Belgium or Japan, or lower density countries like Denmark, Italy, basically that same result obtains. You've got the UK is usually about 4 times as expensive as all of those peer countries.
This is Chris Hayes. Chris is the chief economist at Commonwealth, a progressive think tank which has done a bunch of work recently on how the privatisation of public services like transport can drive up prices.
Whether it's intercity, like suburban, regional, fast speed, all of those, the UK is really at the top of the pack.
If you've watched any of my videos before, then you might have spotted that I live in Plymouth, in southwest England, which is mostly served by GWR.
A train from here to London takes about 3 hours and 15 minutes, depending on how often it stops, or about 4 hours and 25 minutes in the car.
It's also one of the most beautiful train journeys in the country.
Take into account all the environmental benefits, and the train should be an easy win.
In my fairly old and therefore probably quite fuel inefficient car, that journey will probably cost me in the region of 43 quid in fuel. By train, a standard class ticket bought on the day can cost as much as £149.50.
Heck, for 130 quid, I can fly with a cabin bag from Newquay, which is a good chunk further away in Cornwall.
Now, the really important caveat to this is that £149.50 ticket is for a ticket bought on the day during peak times. And if any of the management from any of the remaining train operating companies or from the government were here, what they would probably want me to say is that you can find cheaper tickets if you know how.
For example, if I choose to travel at an off-peak time, which is either after 9 AM or 9:30 AM, depending on where you're travelling from, the price drops to a slightly more tenable £104. If I travel slap bang in the middle of the day, I can likely grab a super off-peak ticket, which will bring things down even further to £74.90. And then there's railcards. If I were a bit younger or much older or travelling with a friend or a veteran, I might be able to save money using one of 9 nationally available discount cards or one of the several local equivalents. These mostly allow you to get a third off the price of any ticket, as long as you travel either after 9:30 AM or 10 AM, depending on where you are. Also, on some railcards, you can sometimes travel before 10 AM as long as your fare costs over a certain amount. And let's not forget about advance tickets. The majority of train tickets in the UK are bookable up to 12 weeks in advance, often with even greater discounts if you travel at awkward times. The limitation here is that you are committed to a certain service and can't get a refund should your plans change. Also, sometimes it's cheaper to do what's called split ticketing and buy your tickets for your journey in 2 separate parts.
So yeah, you can find cheaper fares. The problem is that it involves navigating a maddeningly complex train ticketing system which feels like something off Nathan For You.
I implemented a strict dress code requiring customers to wear formal attire just to enter the store. I then had all the dollar TVs moved to an area at the back of the store and had a new wall constructed to surround this area that could only be entered through a tiny 2-foot tall door.
There'll usually be someone who pushes back by saying, oh, but if you really shop around, if you look enough in advance and you find the right time, you can make some good deals if all of those conditions are satisfied and if you have like perfect flexibility over when you need to move and when you need to travel and how far in advance you know that you need to travel.
Throughout the rollout of the Renationalisation project, the government has been cautious not to promise that the change in ownership will definitely lead to cheaper ticket prices.
Do you think rail fares will be cheaper? Under public ownership, we've got to make sure that we've got enough money to provide the services that people want.
However, last November, the announcement came that the DfT would be freezing prices on train tickets in England until at least March 2027.
This never happened once under privatisation, with prices not only consistently rising, but consistently rising above the rate of inflation.
While this will no doubt come as good news to many passengers, far less has been said about the obscenely complicated state of pricing.
The difficulty with the peaks is people don't travel in the peak because they want to. They travel in the peak because they've got to, because they've got to be somewhere in order to be at work.
If cutting ticket prices can at least partly pay for itself through encouraging more passengers, then that seems like a win-win, particularly if there are other cost savings involved in removing shareholders from the equation. The challenge is that in many parts of the country, more passengers might actually be a bad thing.
Oh, let me show you a video.
This is a problem that many passengers face every day on the trains, commuters and long-distance travellers.
This is Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, sat on the floor of the 11 AM train from London King's Cross to Newcastle on the 11th of August 2016. The furore which follows the release of this clip consumed the British media for more than a week.
A row brewing over claims made by Jeremy Corbyn that a train service he used between London and Newcastle was ram-packed.
When it came across the desk of Richard Branson, whose Virgin Trains was running the route at the time, he decided to tweet CCTV pictures of empty seats in an effort to debunk the claim that the train was busy. The Corbyn team then tried to rebut the rebuttal. It was a whole thing.
I was planning on joking here that the coverage was a bit like a true crime documentary.
A minute later, he passed empty but reserved seats in Coach F.
And then I discovered this actual AI-generated true crime-style podcast about the incident.
Buckle up, because we're diving deep into Traingate.
Traingate. It really captures that whirlwind of political maneuvering and public perception. To understand it fully, you really need to remember the context.
Never before have I felt like the machines are coming for my job so specifically.
Likely a big part of the reason that this incident touched a nerve with Branson and then went on to capture the attention of news audiences is that overcrowding on British trains is a big issue.
There certainly is some overcrowding. The overcrowding on peak times is less than it was. There is also, though, overcrowding on long distance services, and that's one of the reasons we need to change how the fares work.
A study published last year found that on a typical day, passengers were forced to stand on more than a third of services during peak hours. In London, more than a quarter of all passengers during peak times travelled standing up. So persistent is this issue and so passionate do people feel about it that train overcrowding in the United Kingdom has its own dedicated Wikipedia page.
Overcrowding on trains is bad enough in and of itself. But the anger which passengers often feel about overcrowding is inseparable from the anger that people feel about prices. In fact, anger about one often fuels anger about another.
People feel pissed off that not only are they paying through the nose for a ticket, there's also a reasonable chance that they might not even get a seat. And standing on the train, particularly trains which aren't designed for standing, it really sucks.
And yet, the inconvenient truth for British Rail passengers is that your ticket isn't expensive in spite of the fact that you're standing. It's kind of expensive because you're standing.
It all comes right back to very basic principles of supply and demand. If a lot of people want to buy or do a thing, the price of that thing tends to rise. And train travel is really, really popular in Britain. Of course, the fact that train fares are set by government here in the UK means the government could opt to keep prices low anyway. The government doesn't have to turn a profit after all. The problems with that are twofold. The first is that the UK rail industry isn't particularly flush with cash. Even with some of the savings associated with not having to pay dividends to shareholders, which will accompany renationalisation, the industry still receives a hefty subsidy, not least in the form of funding to build new lines like the Elizabeth line in London or HS2.
Government subsidy accounts for about half of the whole industry's income.
High fares and complicated ticketing then are the current method which the industry uses to incentivise people to travel at less busy times. If you wanted to be able to tackle both overcrowding and ticket price inflation, then you would have to increase the number of seats which are available to buy. And if the government currently seems a little bit hesitant about the prospect of doing that, it's because adding more seats is actually a bunch more complicated than it might first sound.
Right, here we go again. But first, let me announce a real rail engineer. Oh, come on, like announce. So you like a train announcement. Thank you.
We have one of the most reliable railway systems in Europe in terms of reliability. At the same time, when things go wrong, because of how intensively we use our railway asset, how many trains we run on our track, those delays instantly cause chaos across the whole network. So a small delay can result in enormous problems right the way across the network.
This is Gareth Dennis, a rail engineer and commentator who has also written a book called How the Rails Will Fix the Future.
You cannot separate out the ticketing system from the actual infrastructure and the trains and the capacity itself. So because our railway system is so limited on capacity, essentially fares can be as high as they need, as they can be as extortionately high as they are, because people are already, if the trains are full, then clearly they are able to afford to pay those high, someone is paying those high fares.
He suggested that the challenges surrounding both high ticket prices and overcrowding are really just knock-on effects of constraints surrounding what train experts call capacity.
Very simply, when I talk about capacity, what I mean is how many seats there are per hour going in any direction.
So if you're Lord Hendy or anyone else at the top of Great British Railways and you want to increase the number of train seats available to buy, then you have two main options.
You can have extremely long trains with loads of seats and they don't run quite so frequently.
The first option is simply to increase the number of carriages on each service. And there are times when this is a possible option.
Cross Country, the TOC, which operates some of the longest routes in the country, is notorious for running services with just 4 carriages, where there is often the demand and certainly the ability to run much longer trains. And yet, in many cases, this isn't quite as simple of a fix as it sounds. One of the many downsides of the post-privatisation system, in which ROSCOs own the trains and rent them to TOCs, is that train operating companies generally don't have loads of spare carriages lying around that they can suddenly add to a service which they think might be particularly busy. There's no real incentive to pay to be hiring extra carriages that you might not actually use.
In many cases, however, adding more carriages is a dead end. A train can only be as long as the platforms at which it needs to stop. There have been efforts to extend platform lengths where necessary and possible, but you kind of have to stop somewhere or you end up with a nation that is just one long train platform.
Or you can have shorter trains with fewer seats, but they run really frequently.
Once you've reached the limit with the number of carriages you can fit on each train, then your other option is to introduce more services running more often. And this comes with a bunch of side benefits too.
A more regular service isn't only better because it has more seats, it also means that anyone who misses their train doesn't have to wait as long for the next one. It also allows you to operate a greater variety of trains. You can run an express train, which only stops at major cities, and a stopping service which stops everywhere. Separating out long journeys and short ones in this way is simply better for everyone. And yet, just as you can't have infinite carriages, you also can't run infinite trains. And this is particularly true on Britain's rail network.
The challenge we have in Britain is that our urban centres, so our big city centres, are ridden with bottlenecks, key big bottlenecks.
See, the UK's rail network is old. Really old. And whilst this means much of it is gorgeous, it often means we're trying to make a 21st century rail network out of one designed for the 19th century.
It is very pretty though.
One of the key roadblocks is that there are plenty of portions of the UK rail network which consist of just 2 tracks. One going one way and one going the other. Even with an infinite budget available for trains, this massively decreases the options available when designing your timetable.
Manchester Piccadilly and the Castlefield corridor is a famous one in the north of England, where much of the western, that whole side of the country relies on that pinch point.
Say you want to run one super fast intercity service going the length of the country, carrying holidaymakers and long distance travellers. As that passes through somewhere like Manchester, a big city, it's going to pass through a bunch of different metro stations, which it's not going to stop at, it's just going to breeze through without a care in the world. Then, following along behind that, you can have a little metro station, which will stop at all of those little places, carrying people doing local travel, going to work or to do their shopping, and so far so good, right? This is good. These people aren't held up, and these people get to go to all the local places that they want to go to. The problem comes when you want to run another high-speed train behind that one, because this train is now just stuck behind our little metro train.
Add on the fact that most rail lines in the UK also have freight trains trying to use them as well, and you end up with the mother of all traffic jams.
Meanwhile, in Europe, you saw a situation where long-distance services were being essentially turned to their own separate, segregated system, whether high-speed or not. So these were 2 separate systems that, where they shared tracks, usually had the benefit of lots and lots of spare tracks to run on, so they weren't in conflict with each other.
The solution, then, is to expand out. Building out to 4 or even more tracks suddenly gives you the ability to run different kinds of trains on different tracks at different speeds. Of course, if train travel is reasonably popular here in the UK and making it cheaper and more reliable involves upgrading certain parts of the network, then surely building out in this way must be really popular. Surely the government is keen to steam ahead with such upgrades. I guess it's time to talk about HS2.
Well, what we're announcing today is where the new stations will be for the high-speed rail link, which will go all the way up from the south of the country all the way to the north.
This is Nick Clegg, who at the time he's speaking here is the UK's Deputy Prime Minister. He's talking to the BBC as part of the announcement of the route for HS2, or High Speed 2. A huge infrastructure project which, as he's just said, was planned to run from London in southeast England to Manchester and Leeds in the north of England.
The project was enormous. It was to involve laying hundreds of miles of new track at a cost of £33 billion. Just an absolutely massive project all round.
Speed 2 essentially gave us a new intercity railway system that overlaid the existing railway. So it sat over the top of it, largely separated from it, and gave cities back their railway network.
There was a tension at the heart of Clegg's announcement. As this Guardian article from The Times suggests, some officials within the Department for Transport were keen to avoid focusing too much of the announcement on reduced journey times. The key problem which the project was designed to address was capacity limitations, particularly on the West Coast Main Line, which runs from London through Liverpool to Scotland.
At the same time, this is what the promo video looks like.
With up to 36 high-speed trains running on the network every hour, it'll put 2/3 of the population of Northern England within 2 hours of central London.
Very quickly, the whole debate around HS2 came to be almost entirely about journey times.
This proved difficult to get voters truly excited by.
When you hear that the new line is going to shave 28 minutes off a journey from Birmingham to London, the tendency is perhaps to think of that as a one-off and to perceive it as not very impressive. We perhaps don't immediately consider the fact that shaving 28 minutes off a journey which tens of thousands of people make each day actually means saving thousands of combined person hours every single day.
A focus on journey times also allowed opponents of the project to massage the figures in such a way as to make them sound even less impressive.
The Stop HS2 campaign, for example, preferred to use a figure of 20 minutes based on comparing the improved journey to the very fastest current journeys rather than the average current journeys.
The case for HS2 being bottled down to this, journey times, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes quicker to XYZ, came from the fact that, unfortunately, that business case is the thing that was then briefed to the advisors, that was then briefed to the ministers to talk to the public about. And a sequence of people who had absolutely no understanding of the actual wider strategy for building a railway.
There were also a lot of people opposed to this project.
HS2 managed to assemble an unholy alliance of opponents from all points on the political compass. The first to emerge were the old-school Tories in the English shires, who felt the new route would be an eyesore. Then, perhaps more sympathetically, came the residents and farmers whose homes and land were bought under compulsory purchase powers to make way for the route. There were also the likes of UKIP and the Reform Party, for whom investing in high-speed public transport presumably sounded a bit too European. The most thoughtful opposition perhaps came from the Sun newspaper, which opposed the new line for being woke.
Anger on the right, however, was accompanied by regular shunts from environmental groups.
Prior to 2024, the Green Party of England and Wales was officially opposed to the idea, citing both the high cost and local environmental impacts. Civil disobedience group Extinction Rebellion also opposed the project for similar reasons. Christian Wolmar, who we spoke to earlier, has also been a long-standing opponent. Friends of the Earth described it as costly and damaging, and one group called Stand for the Trees even made a heart-rending campaign ad featuring Emma Thompson.
Over 100 ancient woodlands are set to be destroyed by HS2. Don't let this be their last Christmas. It's time to stand for the trees.
Part of the reason that we saw this groundswell of opposition from an environmental perspective is that the opposition, when it was just a policy, started in right-wing think tanks, and some of those had a kind of a little c conservative bent, and so picked up some of the discussion about environmental impact. Then quite easy to palate for some of the kind of the well-off landowner types, people with large homes living along the route of the railway. That then kind of alongside a groundswell in overall environmental activism through the likes of Extinction Rebellion allowed some of that language to get picked up by much more radical pro-environment people, and sort of allowed some of those talking points to be transferred across from like the right to the left, if you like, and in sort of this strange sort of bedfellows.
On a purely political level then, HS2 quickly found itself pulling uphill, They couldn't even rely on the support of the kinds of environmental groups who, in any other context, you would imagine would probably support a project with the potential to get cars off the road and planes out the sky.
The issue of cost and potential impacts on nature were also ones which tended to exacerbate one another. Efforts to mitigate the impact on animals or woodlands, even when good and necessary, cost money, which made the price tag look even more foreboding. As things stand, the project is planned to cost in excess of £100 billion.
Oh, and did I mention we're not even building the whole thing anymore?
Substantial amounts of it got canned off and the most important bits were cancelled. So yeah, very frustrating that story was just a complete failure of national storytelling there.
In 2021, Conservative Transport Secretary Grant Shapps announced the cancellation of the planned eastern leg of the line up to Leeds and Sheffield. Then, in 2022, a plan to connect the new HS2 line to the existing West Coast Main Line in Goulburn to allow high-speed trains to continue on to Scotland was scrapped as well. Finally, in 2023, Rishi Sunak took advantage of his lame duck period as Prime Minister to cancel the entirety of the project past Birmingham. Sunak argued that the money could be better spent improving existing lines in the north. In doing so, he was trading off a popular narrative at the time that HS2 mostly benefited London and people who were seeking to get to and from the capital, with little benefit for people living and working within each region.
All of this overlooks the fact that HS2 was never really about journey times to and from London at all. It was first and foremost about capacity.
The whole HS2 project was really about giving high-speed trains their own separate tracks, which, yes, would benefit long-distance travellers, but would also allow more and better local services too.
By taking the hub-to-hub long-distance services away, that then frees up the existing network to act as it's best as, which is a suburban network with freight running around on it. And then you can get a nice high-speed interconnect that goes between all the major city centre hubs. So that gives you a massive increase in capacity, potentially 4, 5, 6 times the number of seats per hour per direction on any given line than you have currently.
Any potential that nationalisation might lead to huge upgrades in the network then is going to exist under the shadow of HS2.
The irony of all of this is that the UK has very recently had a similar rail project which both opened late and was more expensive than planned. It took mere weeks in 2022 for the Elizabeth line in London to go from a quote-unquote nightmare to the backbone of travel into and out of the capital for many commuters. Whatever disruption it might have caused in the building, it's verifiably led to new jobs and housing, with 90% of passengers saying it has changed their area for the better. Nevertheless, pushing through new improvements to the network continues to be controversial, regardless of how necessary they are. And that's something which nationalisation is unlikely to change.
And yet, there is another aspect of the rail industry which contributes to high ticket prices and which the government possibly could have done something about and yet is choosing not to. Train nerds, don't worry, it's time to talk about the rolling stock companies. When people look for answers as to why train fares in the UK feel so expensive, they usually tend to assume that it's the train operating companies that are eating up all the cash. The reality, however, is that the likes of Great Western Railway or Advanti are usually operating on quite thin profit margins.
Since 2020, the TOCs have had a deal with the government where they retain a set profit margin of around 2% each year, which is extremely low when compared with other industries. If we want to trace where the money's really going, we have to look at the rolling stock companies.
So these are the companies that own the carriages and then lease them out to the operators.
As I've already mentioned, Britain's rail industry was privatised in such a way that one set of companies, which came to be known as the rolling stock companies, ended up owning the physical trains themselves and then hiring those trains out to another set of companies, the train operating companies. And the idea here was that the ROSCOs would end up having to compete for competition in order to win contracts from the TOCs.
The whole rationale for privatisation, it would make the sector more, it would ensure better quality, greater efficiencies, and it would incentivize investment. And the way in which it would do that is not, it's not by magic that just having a different owner would do it. It's because market competition basically sort of compels you to do well by the customer. Because because otherwise your competitors will eat your lunch.
The government created 3 new private companies who were sold these trains: Angel, Porterbrook and Eversholt. And by all accounts, they were given a pretty good deal on British Rail's existing rolling stock.
British Rail publicly owned trains that we had scrimped and saved for over decades, and a pretty new fleet in the early 90s, given away for trivial amounts of money to, and in fact, what's interesting is the amount that the valuation of that rolling stock was done by the same people who then bought the rolling stock afterwards.
The broad intention was to kind of create car hire companies, but for the railway network. The reality, however, to borrow a phrase from Gareth, was that we ended up creating train landlords.
One problem is that different bits of track often require quite specific trains.
So for the diesel stuff, you can do it on most of the network. For a lot of the electrified stock, it depends on the type of electrification, whether it's overhead line, whether it's third rail stuff.
The so-called Javelin trains, which run from London St Pancras into Kent, for example, have to be able to run on overhead electric wires whilst travelling along the high-speed 1 line to Ashford, and then switch to take power from a third rail electric line for onward journeys into Kent. If you're the TOC operating that line, you can't just decide to hire a different train instead. You need those very specific capabilities. Similarly, if you need a tilting train to enable you to maintain high speeds along the West Coast main line, you're going to need to rent a Pendolino.
The amount of latitude for haggling that you have is actually pretty weak, which can give the ROSCOs the ability to simply railroad the stocks during negotiations.
Rolling stock companies got a lot of this stuff on these assets on the cheap. They then started massively overcharging. This has been very well documented. People started noticing it pretty soon after privatisation. Even the regulators started to realise that competition just didn't happen.
As of the last rail industry finance statistics released by the Office of Rail and Road, ROSCOs were claiming an annual 19% profit margin. They had also paid out £275 million in dividends to shareholders just that year. In fact, in the period since 2018, during which the rail industry has had to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic and recovery, the owners of the rolling stock companies have managed to walk away with £1.8 billion in dividends.
What makes this worse is that the era of privatisation has seen the amount of government subsidy going to the railway industry increase, meaning that those profits and shareholder dividends aren't only coming from expensive fares, but also more or less directly from government coffers.
So actually, the ROSCOs, even while they weren't directly receiving any subsidy, they were receiving a great deal of indirect subsidy that was being channeled through the operating companies.
Talking about rail nationalisation over the past few years, it's been tempting to talk about how Britain is nationalising its trains. The reality, however, is that the physical trains themselves are remaining in private hands, as is the ability to charge through the nose for their use.
Those companies have invested, tens of millions of pounds in rolling stock. There's not much point in the government buying that out when actually the service they're providing in terms of the leases of the rolling stock that they're putting into the network are largely very adequate. We will get better value out of it because with GBR we can guarantee a much longer life of contract than ever they could with franchises with relatively short terms. We just want the best for the customer and the taxpayer. So if they offer us a good deal for future rolling stock, we'll take it. And if they don't, we'll do something different, won't we?
It's certainly the case that nationalisation might open up new models for ordering and funding new rolling stock. The trains for HS2, for example, will be owned directly by HS2 Limited, the publicly backed company building the line. It's also possible that the government's newfound monopoly over running services might allow it to negotiate better deals.
With over 80% of Britain's trains still owned by the rolling stock companies, however, that outflow of cash from the industry to shareholders is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. And all of that contributes to the need for high ticket prices and government subsidy. Nevertheless, bringing the rest of the rail industry together under one roof isn't completely pointless. That's a pun because switches, whether you swap from one track to another, are sometimes referred to as points, I think. I'm not an expert. My track is made from wood. Let me show you one last video.
Since the new timetable came in, nearly 2 weeks ago, I've been late to work every single day.
In May 2018, a new timetable was introduced for train journeys in the north and parts of the southeast of England. The changes were meant to be exciting, seeing the implementation of various technical upgrades which had been made to the network in each region over the previous few years.
In the end, it was an absolute disaster.
A brand new timetable, and we didn't have enough drivers, enough trains, or enough tracks to run the timetable, and the consequence of that was that it completely fell over in several parts of the country, resulting in complete travel chaos for millions of people.
Over the next few weeks, over 13,000 train services were cancelled across the country. The transport hubs of Manchester and Hull were hit especially bad, along with many commuter towns around London. During certain peak times, nearly 2/3 of all train journeys didn't even leave the first station.
We saw essentially the collapse of the previous system of operating passenger trains in the UK.
The key problem was a lack of drivers.
Both of the train operating companies which were the worst affected technically had enough drivers, but they hadn't had the necessary training on the correct rolling stock and routes to allow them to run the required services. The new timetable also ended up being drawn up later than would usually be expected, giving everyone less time to adapt. Underlying all of these specific problems, however, was the core issue of industry fragmentation.
We've spoken a lot in this video about the decoupling of rolling stock companies and train operating companies. But the manner in which the train industry was fragmented during privatisation has led to all kinds of absolutely bizarre examples of friction and added expense.
Because they broke up a coherent integrated business into lots of different companies. Each of those companies had to have relations with other companies, and therefore they had to have lawyers, and they had to have human resources departments, and they had to have managing directors, and they had to find ways of allocating risk and so on.
Tomorrow morning, there'll be a meeting between operating and engineering people all over Britain, various meetings, looking at what happened yesterday. I want that meeting to concentrate on making sure it doesn't happen tomorrow. I don't want it to worry about whose fault it was and where the money goes to as a consequence. Because what we've learned over 30 years of the railway is that people just get used to that. It's a blame game. It doesn't solve problems in the way that it should.
In drawing up plans for Great British Railways, the government have talked a lot about the new organisation as creating a single directing mind for the industry. Bringing maintenance of the track and stations back together with the running of services should, in theory, mean everyone is pulling in the same direction.
That's a much better way of organising things than me having a contract to repair the track and you having a contract to run the trains and us or the people who work for us going off into a corner and having a big row about whose fault yesterday's delay was and, more importantly, who should pay for it.
There is, in theory, also a decent amount of money to be saved here. The Department for Transport has expressed that it expects to save around £100 million in management fees.
What I want people to do is to work together to produce the best service they can. And that's not just altruistic. Actually, the railway will do better if it's more reliable. We know that what happens is you generate more passengers. That improves revenue. That will reduce the cost to the taxpayer, which is absolutely massive following COVID. And in the end, it will produce something better for the country, better for the country's economy, better for society, and better for jobs, growth and homes.
At the same time it's freezing prices, it's also looking to cut back on the amount of subsidy the industry receives.
Fundamentally, the railways are, the railway is a system. From an engineering perspective, it is a system. And in a way, we're kind of undoing some of the last 30 years where we kind of pretended it wasn't a system and split it all off, stitching it back together.
I'm reluctant to try and promise extraordinary benefits out of this in terms of much cheaper fares, because the reality is the Treasury are putting billions into the railway more than pre-COVID because the number of people travelling to work is less than it was. But what I am absolutely convinced we can do is to make it fairer, make it easier to pay, make it more transparent about what you can do to get cheap tickets and prices that are affordable in a way that people will trust the railway more.
Nationalisation isn't going to magically fix all of the railway industry's problems. What it is, however, is a signal that public transport is important. Too important to be left up to the often short-term whims of private companies. What it does more than anything is puts rail transport back on the ballot paper, meaning that even if you don't think that this particular government does a fantastic job of running the railways, you kind of get the option to vote for another one. If you want to see Britain's railway network stretched to its limits, then you need to go over and check out the recent season of Jetlag the Game, which turns the UK's rail network into a massive board game.
If you live in the UK, you can also feel extremely jealous as the team speed around on unlimited travel tickets they only sell to tourists. Jetlag is a Nebula original series, and it's just one of an incredible range of original shows available on the platform.
You've probably heard of Nebula by now. It's the premium streaming service created by myself and a bunch of other thoughtful creators.
If, like me, you're a massive fan of the video essays of Lindsay Ellis, for example, and have been feeling her absence on YouTube, you'll be very excited to know that she is still releasing stuff pretty regularly over on Nebula, much of which is completely exclusive to the platform. I recently really enjoyed her dive into the rise of body cam YouTube, exploring the ethics of this strange new evolution of the true crime genre.
Lindsay's work is just a slither of an ever-growing catalogue of exclusive films and shows available to watch only on Nebula.
But joining the platform also allows you to watch all of my regular videos from both this main channel and my second channel ad and sponsor free. If you use my link go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, you can get 50% off an annual plan, which brings the price down to just £2.50 per month, or whatever your local equivalent is.
That's far, far cheaper than any other streaming platform out there, and there are also no uplifts for 4K or no ads or whatever they're trying to get away with now either.
Or, if you don't want to add another monthly payment to your budget, you can sign up for a lifetime subscription. This costs more up front, and yet it grants you access to Nebula for as long as both you and the platform exist.
Signing up to Nebula really does help support my work. It allows us to come and interview important people and do a little bit of traveling to make the stuff even better. Not only do we get paid more every time you watch our stuff over on Nebula, but we also get a little bit of a kickback whenever you sign up using my link. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you over on Nebula.
All that's left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to the people who support my work over on Patreon. Those people over on the top tier are Richard, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, Zed C. Reese, Zoe Alden, Alexander Blank, Neil Zabildgard, Sophia R., Sergio Suarez, Richard Rapoon, Gabriel Koch, Fiasco Linguini, Agent Maxwell, Glenn Sugden, Emil, Jarabar, Yillamson, Paulius Edicus, Sam Fortunato, Sondre Yarsenjean, Douglas Urquhart, Ahmed Harachik, and Hasty. If you want to join them in getting little insights into what I'm working on at any point, copies of the script to my videos, and a bunch of other stuff, you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next video.